Dust clung to everything in Redemption Gulch, the tired, clapboard buildings, the thirsty horses at the trough, and the secrets buried just beneath the sun-baked earth. It was a place where a person's past could die or rise up and kill them. For Rosalind Tate, a woman with eyes that held the memory of a storm, it was meant to be a sanctuary. But when the most powerful man in the valley, rancher Jedediah Stone, found her near collapse on her own land, his simple act of concern would ignite a firestorm. Her desperate cry, a plea torn from a place of deep pain, would be the last thing he heard before the world went black, leaving a weeping woman, a fallen man, and a valley hungry for a villain. The Wyoming wind was a relentless thief. It stole the warmth from your bones, the moisture from your lips, and the hope from your heart, if you let it. Rosalind Tate had bargained away her last vestiges of hope, miles back, trading them for a grim, unyielding resolve. Her new property, a 160-acre plot of stubborn dirt and rock called the Bramble, was a testament to that resolve. It was a miserable piece of land, scorned by most, but it was hers. Bought and paid for, with the last of the money she'd sown into the hem of her dress money that smelled of fear and desperation. The locals in Redemption Gulch watched her with a mixture of pity and suspicion. A woman alone, with no husband or brother to speak of buying the Bramble. She was either a fool or running from something terrible. They weren't wrong on the second count. Her nearest neighbor, though his main house was a good 2 miles away, was Jedediah Stone. His ranch, the sprawling Stone's Throw, was the lifeblood of the valley. It encompassed thousands of acres of prime grazing land, its borders pressing in on her small plot like a giant, indifferent hand. Jedediah Stone was a man carved from the same granite as the mountains that loomed over the valley. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and sorrow, he was known to be firm, but fair. He had buried a wife and a son in the small cemetery behind the town's church, and had since poured all of himself into his land. Rosalind had seen him from a distance, a formidable figure on a powerful roan horse, his presence as vast and intimidating as his property. She'd made it a point to avoid him, just as she avoided the probing eyes of the townswomen and the speculative glances of the saloon patrons. Solitude was her shield. The rattling of the wind in the sagebrush was the only company she desired. Her first week was a blur of back-breaking labor. She'd managed to get the small, dilapidated cabin into a livable state, patching the roof and chasing out the families of mice who had claimed it. Her well was shallow, and the water tasted of iron, but it was wet. She had a milk cow, a few chickens, and a will that refused to break. The confrontation she had been dreading came on the 8th day. She was trying to mend a stretch of rusted barbed wire that separated her property from his, her hands raw and bleeding through her thin work gloves. The rhythmic thud of hoofbeats grew louder, and she knew without looking who it was. She stiffened her back to the rider, continuing her work with a frantic, pointless energy. "That's a fool's task," a deep voice rumbled behind her. "That wire's been rust since before the war. A strong wind will tear it right out again." Rosalind slowly turned. Jedediah Stone sat atop his roan, looking down at her. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, took in her worn dress, her dirt-smudged face, and her bleeding hands. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a stark, unblinking assessment. "It marks the boundary, Mr. Stone," she replied, her voice steady despite the hammering in her chest. "That's all I needed to do." The boundary was never in question. "Mrs. Tate," he said, using her name. He knew who she was, of course he did. "What is in question is your sense. This land, it's unforgiving. It breaks men stronger than you." The words were not meant to be cruel, perhaps, but they landed like stones. It was the same sentiment she'd seen in every man's eyes since she'd arrived. You are weak. You are a woman. You do not belong. I have the deed, Mr. Stone. My sense or lack thereof is my own concern, she said, turning back to the wire. He was silent for a long moment. She could feel his gaze on her, heavy and unreadable. There's a storm coming in from the north, the kind that drops the temperature 30 degrees in an hour. Your cabin is in a low-lying draw. It'll flood. My man Caleb can help you move your stock to higher ground. I've a small lined shack just past that ridge you can use till it passes. It was an offer of help, but it felt like a command. It felt like an intrusion. He was telling her what to do, assuming her incompetence. The ghosts of her past screamed in her ears, the voices of men who had dictated her every move, who had seen her not as a person, but as a possession to be managed. I thank you for the warning, but I'll manage, she said, her voice clipped and cold. A muscle tightened in Jedediah's jaw. He was not a man accustomed to having his help refused. Suit yourself, he said, his tone hardening. He wheeled his horse around. But when your cow is drowning and you're freezing in a foot of mud, don't come crying to me. This land doesn't care for pride. He rode off, leaving Rosalind, trembling not from the cold, but from a rage so profound it threatened to choke her. He saw her as a foolish, prideful woman. He saw her as a problem to be managed. He had no idea that her pride was all she had left. It was the one thing her brutal deceased husband, Walter, had never been able to beat out of her. She would sooner freeze to death in a muddy cabin than accept help from a man who looked at her with such dismissive authority. The wind began to bite, and the sky to the north was turning a bruised, ominous purple. Jedediah Stone was right. A storm was coming, and Rosalind Tate, alone on her miserable patch of dirt, braced for it. The storm did not just arrive. It assaulted the valley. It came with a fury that seemed personal, a malevolent force that tore at the very fabric of the world. The wind howled like a banshee, ripping shingles from Rosalind's newly patched roof. Rain fell not in drops, but in solid wind-driven sheets that turned her small yard into a churning sea of mud. Jedediah's prediction had been an understatement. The draw where her cabin sat became a river. Icy water crept over the threshold, swirling around the legs of her small table. Her chickens, their coop inundated, were perched miserably on the rafters inside the cabin. Her milk cow, tethered to a post on what had been the highest point of her yard, was now standing belly-deep in the rising floodwater, lowing in terror. Rosalind was soaked to the bone, her body racked with shivers that had nothing to do with the cold. Panic, cold and sharp, was beginning to pierce through her stubborn resolve. She had to get the cow to higher ground, but the ground was dissolving around her. Every step was a battle against the sucking mud and the force of the current. It was in this desperate struggle, wrestling with the cow's rope while the rain lashed her face, that she heard it a shout, barely audible over the roar of the storm. Through the grey curtain of rain, a figure on horseback emerged. It was Jedediah Stone. He wasn't on his usual roan, but a powerful draft horse better suited for the treacherous terrain. His young ranch hand, Caleb, was right behind him. Jedediah didn't waste words. He dismounted, plunging into the thigh-deep water, his face a grim mask of concern. "Caleb, get the rope. We'll pull her out toward the ridge." Rosalind stood, frozen water streaming from her hair into her eyes. He had come back. After her cold dismissal, he had come back. A part of her was humiliated, a part of her infuriated, but the largest part was drowning in a desperate, shameful relief. "I told you this would happen," he yelled over the wind, grabbing the rope from her numb fingers. His touch was rough, impersonal, focused only on the task. "This is no place for stubborn pride, woman." Together they fought the storm for the animal. Caleb, wiry and quick, secured a second rope around the cow, while Jedediah used his sheer strength to guide the terrified animal through the torrent. Rosalind pushed from behind her muscles, screaming in protest, her mind a numb buzz of cold and fear. Finally, they reached the slight incline leading toward the ridge he had pointed out earlier. The cow, finding more solid footing, scrambled the rest of the way. They stood there for a moment, gasping for breath, the three of them, and the animal huddled against the wind. "She'll be all right here for now," Jedediah said, his voice less harsh, now laced with exhaustion. He turned to face Rosalind. Rain plastered her thin dress to her body, and she was trembling uncontrollably. Her face was deathly pale, her lips tinged with blue. "You're freezing," he stated, his brow furrowing. "You need to get dry. The line shack is just over this rise." Before she could protest, he moved toward her. He was just trying to help, she knew that. His expression was one of genuine concern, not pity or condescension. He saw a fellow human being freezing in a storm, and his instinct was to offer warmth, to offer shelter. He reached out a large, calloused hand to place it on her shoulder, to guide her, perhaps to steady her. It was a simple, universal gesture of comfort. But his hand was heading for a very specific place, the place on her upper back, just beside her shoulder blade, the place she kept covered at all times, the place where the skin was a mangled, puckered mess of scar tissue shaped into a crude W. Walter's brand, his mark of ownership. The moment his fingers grazed the rough fabric of her dress, a primal terror shot through her like lightning. The cold, the rain, the storm, it all vanished, replaced by the memory of searing heat, the smell of burning flesh, and the sound of a man's cruel laughter. "Don't!" The word was a choked gasp. Jedediah froze, his hand hovering in the air. He looked confused. "Mrs. Tate!" "Don't touch me there." She wept the words torn from her throat. She stumbled back away from him, clutching her shoulder as if his touch had been a hot iron. Tears mixed with the rain on her face, but these were tears of a different, older storm. "Please, just don't." He stared at her, his face a canvas of bewilderment and dawning concern. He saw not just a cold, stubborn woman, but a terrified one. The anger and frustration in his eyes softened into something else, something akin to empathy. He took a half step forward, his hand still slightly outstretched, his intention shifting from practical help to offering solace. "Ma'am, I don't know what—" he began, his voice low and gentle. He reached out again, not to touch her, but as if to show he meant no harm. And then it happened. His eyes, which had been locked on hers, suddenly widened. The color drained from his face. A look of profound shock, of sudden sharp agony, seized his features. His outstretched hand faltered, curling into a fist that he pressed against his chest. He gasped a ragged, wet sound, and his other hand flew to his throat. "Mr. Stone!" Caleb cried out, seeing the change. Jedediah Stone, the granite pillar of the valley, swayed on his feet. He looked down at his own chest in disbelief. Then his gaze drifted back to Rosalind's tear-streaked face. A silent question flickered in his eyes. And then he collapsed. He fell face first into the mud and swirling water, a dead weight. The storm raged on indifferent. Caleb screamed his name, and Rosalind stood frozen, her own private horror momentarily eclipsed by the shocking, inexplicable sight of the powerful rancher lying motionless at her feet. The world slowed to a crawl each moment, thick and heavy like the mud sucking at their boots. Caleb's frantic shouts of "Jed, Mr. Stone!" were swallowed by the wind. Rosalind stared paralyzed at the massive shape of Jedediah Stone, half submerged in the floodwater. The man who had been a force of nature only moments before was now terrifyingly still. It was Caleb who broke the spell. The young ranch, and his face pale with terror, scrambled to Jedediah's side, rolling him over. Mud caked the rancher's face, and his lips were an alarming shade of grey. "He ain't breathing right!" Caleb yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "We gotta get him to the shack." Adrenaline, cold and clean, sliced through Rosalind's shock. Guilt, confusion, and a primal need to act spurred her forward. Together they dragged Jedediah's immense, uncooperative body out of the water and up the muddy slope. It was a Herculean effort that left them both gasping and trembling, their muscles burning. The line shack was a small one-room refuge, musty and smelling of pine smoke and old leather. They laid Jedediah on the narrow cot, his boots dripping muddy water onto the floorboards. Rosalind, her hands shaking, worked to unbutton his sodden coat and shirt. His chest was broad and covered in a mat of greying hair, but what caught her attention was the faint, lacy network of spidery veins across his skin, a detail she filed away without understanding its significance. His breathing was shallow and erratic, a faint, rasping whistle with each exhalation. "You stay with him," she commanded Caleb, her voice finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. "Keep him warm. I'm going for the doctor." "Alone in this?" Caleb gaped at her, then at the raging storm outside. "There's no other way." She took Jedediah's draft horse, a beast of an animal that was far more sure-footed than her own mare would have been. The 2-mile ride to Redemption Gulch was a nightmare journey through a world that had dissolved into wind and water. She rode with a singular desperate focus. The image of Jedediah's collapsing form burned into her mind. Her plea, "Don't touch me there," echoed in her head, twisting into an absurd self-accusation. Had her fear somehow caused this? It was illogical, impossible, but the guilt was a cold knot in her stomach. She burst into Doc Abernathy's clinic like a ghost, dripping water and mud on his clean floor. The old doctor, a man with kind eyes and hands, stained with a lifetime of remedies, took one look at her and grabbed his medical bag without a word. By the time they returned, the storm had begun to ease, but the damage was done. Doc Abernathy worked over Jedediah's still form by the light of a kerosene lamp, his face grim. He listened to the man's heart and lungs, checked his eyes, and felt the weak pulse at his throat. "It's his heart," the doctor finally announced, his voice low. "It's beating like a trapped bird, faint and fast. But there's something else. I can't put my finger on it. It's not a simple cardiac event. Did he fall?" Hit his head. "No," Rosalind whispered. "He just fell." The news of Jedediah Stone's collapse spread through Redemption Gulch faster than the flood waters receded. Caleb sent to the main ranch to fetch help, and a wagon had delivered the news. And with the news delivered by a shaken young man came the story of the strange confrontation that preceded it. The narrative began to twist. It started in the general store, run by Martha Beasley, a woman whose ears were as sharp as her tongue. Caleb said the new widow, Mrs. Tate, screamed at him right before he went down. She told a customer her voice, a conspiratorial whisper, screamed at him something fierce. By the time the story reached the saloon, it had grown darker. "Heard she put a hex on him." One cowhand slurred over his whiskey. "Touched him, and he dropped like a stone. They say she's one of them black widows." The most venomous whispers, however, came from a well-dressed, calculating man named Silas Kane. Kane was a land speculator from Cheyenne who had been trying for months to buy up the smaller ranches in the valley, with his ultimate prize being the stone's throw. Jedediah had been the main obstacle, a bulwark of community and tradition against Kane's relentless ambition. With Jedediah incapacitated, the valley was vulnerable. A little chaos would serve his purposes perfectly. Seated at his usual table in the saloon, Kane swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "It's a strange business," he said loud enough for those nearby to hear. "A healthy man like Jedediah doesn't just collapse, and this Mrs. Tate, she appears from nowhere, buys a worthless plot of land right on his border, and within 2 weeks he's at death's door. It does make one wonder." He didn't need to say more. He had planted the seed, and the fertile ground of fear and suspicion did the rest. Rosalind felt the change immediately. When she went into town for supplies the next day, the friendly nods she had started to receive were gone. They were replaced by hostile stares and hushed whispers that ceased the moment she drew near. Martha Beasley served her in stony silence, practically throwing her change on the counter. Children who had previously watched her with simple curiosity now pointed and scurried away. The weight of their judgment was a physical thing pressing down on her, suffocating her. She was once again the outsider, the pariah. But this was worse than before. Before she was an object of pity and curiosity. Now she was an object of fear and hatred. The ordeal culminated with a visit from Sheriff Brody. He was a decent man, weary and overworked, who stood on her porch, twisting the brim of his hat in his hands. "Ma'am," he began, avoiding her eyes. "Folks are talking. They're saying there was an argument, that you were screaming at Jedediah right before he collapsed." "There was no argument," Rosalind said, her voice tight. "He was helping me. I was startled. I cried out. That's all." "And why were you startled, Mrs. Tate?" The sheriff pressed his gaze, finally meeting hers. What did he do? How could she explain? How could she lay bare the most humiliating secret of her life to this man, to this town that had already condemned her? The brand on her back was a testament to her shame, to her failure to escape a monster sooner. It was a private agony, not a public defense. "It's a personal matter," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Sheriff Brody sighed a long, tired sound. "Ma'am, a man like Jedediah Stone doesn't just fall down for no reason. Doc Abernathy is baffled. Until we know what happened, you are going to be at the center of this. My advice, stay on your property and don't give anyone a reason to cause you more trouble." It was both a warning and a threat. She was being officially ostracized, confined to her own land by a wall of suspicion. As the sheriff rode away, Rosalind leaned against the rough wood of her cabin, the silence of the valley pressing in on her. She had come to Redemption Gulch to escape a prison. She had just found herself in a new one. Jedediah Stone didn't die, but he didn't wake up either. He was moved from the line shack to his own bed in the main house of the Stone's Throw Ranch, a sprawling log and stone structure that felt empty and silent without its master's commanding presence. Doc Abernathy visited twice a day, his frustration growing with each visit. "His heart is weak, but it's stable," the doctor confessed to Caleb, who had refused to leave the ranch. "It's like he's been drugged, but there's no opium on his breath, no sign of laudanum. It's as if his body is fighting a poison I can't name." Confined to the bramble, Rosalind was trapped in a vortex of her own thoughts. The town's accusation was a dull, constant ache, but the real torment was the unanswered question, what had happened to Jedediah? Her logical mind knew her cry hadn't felled him, but what if the shock of it, the raw terror in her voice, had somehow triggered a hidden weakness in him? The thought was a private torture. She knew she couldn't clear her name while he lay unconscious. Her only hope was for him to wake up and tell everyone what happened. But what if he never woke up? Or what if he woke up and his memory was gone? She would be branded a murderess for the rest of her days. The irony was so bitter it felt like swallowing ash. The world couldn't see the real brand, so it was determined to give her a new one. Her only ally, unexpectedly, was Caleb. The young man had seen what happened. He'd seen the concern on Jedediah's face and the pure terror on hers. He didn't understand it, but he knew malice wasn't part of the equation. A few days after the incident, he appeared at her property line, leading a pack mule. "Doc says Mr. Stone ain't getting any better," he said, his young face etched with worry. He gestured to the mule. "Brought you some supplies from the ranch pantry. Figured you might not be welcome in town." Rosalind felt a surge of gratitude so sharp it brought tears to her eyes. "Why are you helping me, Caleb?" He scuffed his boot in the dirt. "Because I was there. You didn't do nothing. And Jed, he wouldn't want folks treating you this way. He was trying to help you." That simple statement of faith was the first crack of light in her dark world. She invited him in for a cup of coffee, and for the first time, she had a real conversation with someone in Redemption Gulch. She learned about Jedediah, about his kindness to his workers, his deep love for the land, his unspoken grief for his lost family. He was a good man. Caleb insisted a hard man on the outside, but good to the core. He kept to himself about his health, though, Caleb mused, stirring his coffee. Couple times over the last year, I saw him getting winded after a hard ride. He'd press on his chest like he was trying to rub out a pain. When I'd ask, he'd just grunt and say he was getting old. This was a crucial piece of information, a pre-existing condition. "Did Doc Abernathy know about this?" Rosalind asked. "Doubt it." Caleb shook his head. "Mr. Stone is a proud man. Wouldn't admit to any weakness." Rosalind's mind began to race, a weak heart combined with a shock. It was possible. But Doc Abernathy had suspected something more, a poison. What if it wasn't one or the other? What if it was both? What if something had been introduced into his system that would only be truly dangerous to a man with a compromised heart? "Caleb," she said, her voice firm with a newfound purpose. "I need to know everything Jedediah ate and drank in the 2 days before he collapsed. Everything." Caleb, eager to help, detailed his boss's routine. The morning coffee always brewed strong and black. The water from the well by the main house. The steak and potatoes he'd had for dinner the night before. The whiskey he drank every evening, a single glass from a specific bottle of aged bourbon he kept in his study. "The whiskey," Rosalind said, seizing on the detail. "Is the bottle still there?" That evening, Caleb returned, slipping out of the Stone's Throw Ranch under the cover of darkness. He carried the heavy ornate bottle of bourbon. He also brought a small leather-bound journal. "It's his," Caleb whispered, handing it to her. "He wrote in it most nights. Maybe it says something." Rosalind thanked him, her mind alight with a desperate hope. After he left, she lit her lamp and first examined the whiskey. She uncorked it, sniffing the contents. It smelled of oak and grain, nothing more. She poured a small amount into a saucer. It looked perfectly normal, but a tasteless, odorless substance could easily be missed. Then she opened the journal. Jedediah's handwriting was surprisingly neat, the script of a man who was deliberate in all things. Most entries were about the ranch cattle prices, rainfall, fence lines that needed mending. But as she flipped back through the weeks, a pattern emerged. July 10th. Another spell of tightness in the chest this morning. Abernathy would have my hide if he knew. Just old age catching up. July 22nd. Rode up to the north pasture. Had to dismount and catch my breath. Damned annoying. August 5th. Kane was in town again, sniffing around Miller's property. He's a vulture. Offered me a fortune for the throw. Told him he could have it when they pry it from my cold, dead hands. The entry confirmed his heart condition and his conflict with Silas Kane. But it was the entry from the day before the storm that made her blood run cold. August 12th. Felt unwell all day. A strange bitterness to the coffee this morning. Cook must have scorched the beans. My vision swam for a moment after lunch. The whiskey tonight tastes off too. Everything feels wrong. A bitterness. Her heart hammered against her ribs. It wasn't scorched beans. It was poison, administered slowly in small doses in things he consumed every day. The storm, the physical exertion of helping her, the shock of her reaction, it had all been the final straw for a heart already weakened and struggling against a toxin. But who would do it? The journal gave her the answer. Cain is a vulture. Told him he could have it when they pry it from my cold, dead hands. Silas Cain wanted the ranch, and he was patient enough to kill for it, slowly making it look like a natural decline. She felt a sudden, desperate need for Caleb to see what she had found. But she also knew she needed to give him something in return for his trust. She couldn't ask him to believe her to risk himself further while she was still hiding behind her own walls. When he came the next morning, she had him sit down. With trembling hands, she turned her back to him and pulled the collar of her dress aside, exposing the scarred flesh beneath. "This is why I screamed," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "My late husband, he did this, to mark me as his. When Mr. Stone went to touch my shoulder, he touched this place, and for a second I wasn't in Wyoming anymore. I was back there." Caleb let out a soft gasp. He was silent for a long, respectful moment. "Ma'am," he finally said, his voice full of a new, profound understanding. "I'm sorry. I'm truly sorry." The confession had broken her open, but it had also cemented their alliance. She showed him the journal. His eyes widened as he read the final entry. "The coffee. The whiskey," he breathed. "It has to be Cain. We need proof, Caleb, and we need to know what he used." Rosalind, who had learned much about herbs and plants from a mother who was a skilled healer, began to think. A poison that weakens the heart, causes blurred vision, and has a bitter taste. Her mind flipped through a mental catalogue of natural toxins, and then it landed on one. A plant that grew wild in the shadowed, damper parts of the valley. A plant with dark berries and bell-shaped flowers, Atropa belladonna, deadly nightshade. "I think I know what it is," she said grimly, "and I think I know where we might find proof." The plan was audacious, born of desperation and a shared, simmering rage. While Rosalind searched for the physical proof, the plant itself, Caleb would be their eyes and ears, watching Silas Cain. "He has a small office he rents above the Mercantile," Caleb told her. "Spends most of his time there, poring over maps and deeds. He also has a room at the boarding house, but he's careful. Never leaves much behind." Rosalind's search began in the wooded creeks and shaded hillsides, places where the sun was less fierce. She remembered the warnings her mother had given her about the beautiful but deadly plant. After hours of searching her dress, torn by thorns and her face scratched by branches, she found it a small, bushy plant growing in the shadow of a rock, outcropping its dull purple flowers in bloom and its berries like shiny black pearls. Deadly nightshade. She carefully harvested a few leaves and berries, wrapping them in a handkerchief, her heart pounding with a grim sense of validation. Meanwhile, Caleb began his surveillance. He pretended to be running errands in town, loitering near the Mercantile, watching the stairway that led to Cain's office. He observed the man's comings and goings, noting who he met with mostly nervous-looking ranchers whom Cain was pressuring to sell. The break came 2 days later. Caleb saw Cain leave his office and head to the saloon. Seizing the opportunity, Caleb found the young boy who swept the Mercantile and offered him a nickel to create a distraction. A spilled barrel of pickles at the foot of the stairs was enough to draw the store owner's attention. In that moment of confusion, Caleb slipped up the stairs and used a piece of wire to jimmy the flimsy lock on Kane's office door. The office was neat, almost sterile. A large desk, a map of the valley pinned to the wall with Jedediah's land, circled in red, and a filing cabinet. He worked quickly, his nerves screaming. In the cabinet, he found deeds, contracts, and legal threats. But in the bottom drawer of the desk, beneath a stack of blank paper, he found a small, locked metal box. It was too strong to break open. Frustrated, he was about to leave when his eyes caught something else, a small, crumpled receipt in the wastebasket. He snatched it and fled, his heart hammering. He met Rosalind at the edge of her property as dusk fell. He handed her the receipt. It was from an apothecary in Cheyenne, dated 2 months prior. The script was faint, but the items were legible: 1 ounce of atropine sulfate, a concentrated refined alkaloid of belladonna, and a bottle of digitalis, another powerful heart medication that, when combined with atropine in the wrong dosage, could be lethal. The buyer's name was smudged but discernible: S. Kane. "My God, Caleb," Rosalind breathed, staring at the paper. "This is it. This is the proof." Atropine would explain the bitterness, the blurred vision. Digitalis would attack the heart directly. Kane wasn't just poisoning Jedediah. He was conducting a slow, calculated execution. Their victory was short-lived. Their covert activities had not gone unnoticed. Silas Kane was a man who paid attention to details, and a loyal ranch hand from the stone's throw, suddenly spending all his time in town, was a detail worth noting. He had one of his hired men, a surly gun-for-hire named Pike, follow Caleb. The next evening, as Caleb was heading back to the ranch, Pike and another man cornered him in a narrow alleyway. "Mr. Kane wants to know what you and the pretty widow are whispering about," Pike snarled, pressing Caleb against a brick wall. Caleb's blood ran cold, but he kept his face a mask of defiance. "I don't know what you're talking about." Pike laughed, a nasty, humorless sound. He landed a sharp punch in Caleb's gut, doubling him over. "Don't play dumb. We know you were in his office. What did you take?" When Caleb refused to answer, they beat him. They left him bruised and bleeding in the alley with a final chilling message from Pike. "Mr. Kane says to tell the widow to mind her own business. The valley has a way of swallowing up people who dig where they shouldn't. And you," he added, kicking Caleb one last time, "stay away from her." A bloodied and bruised Caleb stumbled to Rosalind's cabin late that night. She gasped when she saw him immediately tending to his wounds, her hands gentle but her eyes blazing with fury. "He knows," Caleb rasped as she cleaned a cut on his lip. "He knows we're on to him." Rosalind's fear was a cold, metallic taste in her mouth. Kane was no longer just a suspect. He was an active threat. He wasn't just a vulture, he was a snake, and they had just prodded it with a stick. "He thinks he can scare us off," she said, her voice low and hard. "He thinks because you are a boy, and I am a woman, that we will run and hide." She looked at Caleb's swollen eye, at the dark bruises forming on his cheek. She looked at the receipt and the wrapped belladonna leaves on her table. All her life, she had been running from bullies, from men who used their power and their fists to get what they wanted. Walter had tried to break her. This town had tried to shame her. Silas Kane was trying to terrorize her. Something inside her shifted. The fear did not vanish, but it was consumed by a cold, hard anger. "He's wrong," she finished, her voice ringing with a conviction that startled even herself. "We aren't going to hide, Caleb. We're going to take this to the sheriff, and then we're going to take everything from Silas Kane." The stakes had been raised. It was no longer just about clearing her name, or even about justice for Jedediah. It was a fight for their very survival. Sheriff Brody listened, his face a stony mask, as Rosalind and a battered Caleb laid out their story in his small, dusty office. Rosalind presented the Cheyenne apothecary receipt and the carefully wrapped belladonna leaves. Caleb recounted the beating in the alley, his bruised face a testament to his words. Brody examined the evidence, rubbing his tired eyes. "This is a serious accusation, Mrs. Tate. Silas Kane is an important man. He has friends in the territorial government, and Jedediah Stone is dying in his bed while the man who poisoned him sits in the saloon." Rosalind countered, her voice sharp. "Are Kane's friends more important than justice?" The sheriff was clearly conflicted. The receipt was compelling, but it could be explained away. Caleb's beating could be dismissed as a common brawl. Kane would deny everything, and his word carried weight. Brody needed more. He needed an unimpeachable witness. "I need to talk to Doc Abernathy," he said finally. "And I need something more concrete to tie Kane directly to the poison at the ranch." As if on cue, the door to the sheriff's office flew open. A young ranch hand from the stone's throw stood there breathless and wide-eyed. "Sheriff Doc Abernathy sent me. It's Jedediah. He's awake." A jolt went through the room. Rosalind's heart leaped into her throat. Brody grabbed his hat. "Let's go." They arrived at the stone's throw, to a scene of quiet, anxious activity. Doc Abernathy met them at the door, his face exhausted but triumphant. "He woke up about an hour ago," the doctor said. "He's weak, but his mind is clear as a bell. The fever broke. Whatever that poison was, his body has finally fought it off." They entered the bedroom. Jedediah Stone was propped up on several pillows, looking gaunt and pale, a shadow of his former self. But his eyes, though sunken, were alert. They found Rosalind immediately and held her gaze. There was no anger in them, no confusion, only a weary understanding. "Mrs. Tate," he rasped, his voice a dry whisper. "Mr. Stone," she replied softly, stepping closer to the bed. "It wasn't you," he said, each word an effort. "I remember now. The dizziness, the pain in my chest. It had been happening for weeks." Sheriff Brody stepped forward. "Jedediah, we have reason to believe you were poisoned by Silas Kane." Jedediah closed his eyes for a moment, processing this. When he opened them, a fire had been rekindled in their depths. "Kane." He breathed the name like a curse. "The water." Everyone in the room leaned in. "What about the water, Jedediah?" Brody asked. "A few days before the storm." Jedediah struggled to speak his memory, slowly returning. "I saw one of his men, Pike, near my well after dusk. Thought he was just cutting across my land. He saw me and took off fast. Didn't think much of it then." It was the final piece of the puzzle. Kane hadn't just tampered with the coffee and the whiskey inside the house. He had poisoned the source. A slow, steady drip of toxins into the well water, ensuring his victim ingested it with every drink, every meal. "That's enough for me," Sheriff Brody declared, his face set like granite. "That's more than enough." He deputized Caleb on the spot, along with 2 other loyal Stone's Throw ranch hands. "We're going to pay Mr. Kane a visit. Mrs. Tate, you should stay here." "No," Rosalind said, her voice firm. "I started this. I'm going to see it through." Jedediah looked at her, a flicker of admiration in his tired eyes. He nodded slowly. The confrontation took place not in the street, but in the refined quiet of the Grand Hotel's dining room, where Silas Kane was enjoying a late lunch. Sheriff Brody entered first, flanked by his new deputies. Rosalind stood in the doorway, a silent, imposing witness. Kane looked up from his steak, a forkful halfway to his mouth. He smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "Sheriff, to what do I owe the pleasure?" "Silas Kane, you're under arrest for the attempted murder of Jedediah Stone," Brody announced, his voice booming through the suddenly silent dining room. Kane's smile didn't falter, but his eyes turned to ice. He slowly placed his fork down. That's a ridiculous accusation. You have no proof. We have the receipt from the apothecary in Cheyenne for atropine and digitalis, Brody stated calmly. I have a heart condition, Kane lied smoothly. That was my own medication. We have the testimony of your hired man, Pike, who was seen poisoning Jedediah's well. Brody continued bluffing. He watched Kane for a reaction. A flicker of panic crossed Kane's face before he could suppress it. He had been so careful. And the sheriff added his voice, dropping, "We have Jedediah Stone himself. He's awake, Mr. Kane, and he's talking." That was the blow that shattered Kane's composure. The color drained from his face. His carefully constructed world of deceit and manipulation crumbled around him. He knew that Jedediah's word in this valley was gospel. He was finished. Kane lunged for the door, but Caleb and the other ranch hands blocked his path. He turned his eyes wild and saw Rosalind standing there, her expression unyielding. He saw in her face not a frightened widow, but the architect of his downfall. With a snarl of pure hatred, he lunged toward her, but he never reached her. Sheriff Brody's fist connected with Kane's jaw in a solid crack of bone on bone. The land speculator crumpled to the floor unconscious. As the deputies hauled Kane's limp body away, the dining room erupted in murmurs. The tide of public opinion so long against her turned in an instant. The whispers that had once condemned her now praised her. She was no longer the black widow of the bramble. She was the woman who had saved Jedediah Stone. But Rosalind felt no triumph, only a profound, bone-deep weariness, and the quiet satisfaction of a battle hard won. In the weeks that followed, the story of Rosalind Tate and Silas Kane became local legend. Kane's hired man, Pike, confessed everything in exchange for a lighter sentence, corroborating the poisoning of the well and admitting to the assault on Caleb. Kane faced with overwhelming evidence, and Jedediah's testimony was tried and sentenced to hang. The shadow he had cast over the valley was gone. Jedediah Stone recovered slowly but steadily. His strength returned, but the ordeal had changed him. The hardness in his eyes was replaced by a quiet introspection. The granite had been weathered, revealing the resilient man beneath. He had been forced to confront his own mortality, his own stubborn pride in hiding his weakness, and it had humbled him. The town, in its own clumsy way, tried to atone. Baskets of bread and jars of preserves appeared on Rosalind's porch. The very people who had scorned her now offered shy smiles and words of greeting. Martha Beasley from the general store gave her a bolt of fine blue calico, her gruff apology hidden in a complaint about it taking up space on her shelf. Rosalind accepted their offerings with a quiet grace, but she did not forget. The whispers had left their own invisible scars, a reminder of how quickly people could turn, how fragile a reputation could be. She remained on the bramble, finding a quiet solace in the hard work, in the feeling of dirt under her fingernails, in the simple, honest rhythm of life on her own terms. One crisp autumn afternoon, as the leaves of the cottonwood trees turned to gold, Jedediah Stone rode up to her cabin. He no longer looked like an intimidating land baron, but simply a man walking with a slight hesitation that hadn't been there before. He didn't stay on his horse, but dismounted and walked to her porch, holding his hat in his hands. Mrs. Tate. He began, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Rosalind, I never properly thanked you. You don't need to, Mr. Stone, she replied, wiping her hands on her apron. Yes, I do, he insisted. You saved my life. More than that, you fought for me when no one else would have. You showed more courage than any man I've ever known. He looked at her directly, his gaze unwavering. I also need to apologize for that day in the storm. I was arrogant. I misjudged you. We all have our own storms, Mr. Stone, she said, her voice barely a whisper. You just happened to walk into the middle of mine. He nodded, understanding her meaning completely. He gestured toward the horizon, where the vast expanse of his ranch met the endless blue of the Wyoming sky. This land, I thought I owned it. But these last few weeks I've realized we don't own it. We just borrow it for a while. We're just caretakers. He looked back at her, at the small, resilient homestead she had carved out for herself. You're a good caretaker, Rosalind. You have a strength this land understands. He took a tentative step closer. I was a fool to think a piece of paper or a brand could ever truly mark a person's worth. He said, his voice low and full of meaning. He knew without her having to say another word what she had been hiding. Caleb, in his loyalty to them both, had explained everything. A person is marked by their actions, by their character. He didn't reach for her. He stood at a respectful distance, his hands by his sides. But his presence was no longer an intrusion. It was a comfort. It was the quiet promise of a neighbor, a friend. Rosalind looked at this man, a man she had once feared, and saw a fellow survivor. They were both scarred, he by the loss of his family, and his brush with death, she by a past too brutal to name. Their wounds were different, but they spoke the same language of pain and resilience. She gave him a small, genuine smile, the first she had offered to any man in a very long time. Please call me Rosa, she said. In the quiet of the Wyoming afternoon, with the wind whispering through the sagebrush, a new boundary was drawn. It was not one of rust and wire, but one of mutual respect. It was not the end of a story with a ride into the sunset. It was the beginning of something far more real and far more precious. Two lonely, damaged souls standing under the same vast sky, finally finding a reason to heal. In the unforgiving heart of the Old West, true battles weren't always fought with guns. They were fought in the quiet moments of defiance, in the courage to expose a painful truth, and in the strength to trust another soul in a world designed to break you. Rosalind Tate came to Redemption Gulch, seeking an escape, but found a fight. Jedediah Stone thought he had mastered his world only to find himself at the mercy of a hidden evil. Their story reminds us that the deepest scars are often the ones no one can see, and that true justice is not just about punishing the guilty, but about healing the innocent. What did you think of Rosa's incredible courage? Could you have stood up to a whole town that had turned against you? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of survival, mystery, and redemption in the Wild West captured your imagination, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing this video with someone who loves a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to the channel for more true-life dramas from the pages of history. Thank you for listening.